There is a statement that has become quite popular nowadays that says politics is downstream from culture. Basically, what's meant by that is the government will always be a reflection of what the culture has become. As the culture changes, then new leaders will come in and it will start to reflect what the people are like. When you look at the nation of Israel in its ancient history, when it was first established, once the people had gone into the promised land and conquered it and established the nation, it didn't have any type of a central government. Everything was handled on usually the lowest possible level. Essentially, kind of how it worked was this, is that within the community, within the family, within the clan, they were responsible for what happened, for maintaining order, for maintaining justice, and everything else. As if the problem was larger, then it would eventually get to maybe the priesthood or something like that. That was its original design. If there was some kind of a crisis in which one of the tribes was threatened, the other tribes were expected to come in and help as needed. But everything was supposed to be handled on the lowest possible level. As a result, what this meant was you had a very, very small governmental influence. You had a single nation and yet no central government, a lot of personal freedom, but a lot of personal responsibility. Now, as the nation began to sin, as they began to turn away from the Lord, and God would bring judgment on them and to get them to repent, then he would use other outside nations who would come in and invade and attack, and God would raise up what were referred to as judges. The judges would be leaders. Usually, most of the judges didn't necessarily rule over the entire nation. They didn't influence the entire nation. They oftentimes focused their ministry and their time in just a specific area of the nation. But they were basically leaders. Yes, they would decide in judicial cases like we would think of as a judge, but they did more than that. They tended to be political as well, being military leaders and even religious leaders. The last of the judges was an individual by the name of Samuel. And Samuel was not only the last of the judges, he was the first of the writing prophets. Not the first prophet, but the first prophet who actually wrote down and wrote about his ministry, his messages, things like that. And in 1 Samuel chapter 8, you come to the end. You're starting to get down to the end of the life of Samuel. It says in verse 1, when Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges over Israel. His firstborn son's name was Joel, and his second was Abijah. They were judges in Beersheba. However, his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned towards dishonest gain. They took bribes. They perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and went to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, "Look, you are old, and your sons do not follow your example. Therefore, appoint a king to judge us, the same as all the other nations have." So, again, when you come to this point, Samuel had been judging Israel. He had been the leader, basically Israel's leader, for decades. And he realized he was getting on up there in years, and came to realize that, he had fewer days ahead of him than he had behind him. And with that realization, he was concerned about leadership within the nation. And so he had started basically giving over some of his personal authority into the hands of his two sons, and started giving them some of the jobs. So if there was this conflict down in one area, then they could turn to his two sons rather than Samuel having to do all of the work together. By the way, there is no there is no condemning in Scripture of Samuel having done that. In fact, Moses was told to do the exact same thing, that his time was being taken up by in focusing too much on all of the people's problems, and so he needed to appoint judges. And so this is basically what Samuel did. It's a good idea. It's a division of labor, makes things easier when more people are involved in helping out. The problem, though, is that Samuel's sons, they did not have their father's integrity and spiritual maturity. They saw this job, they saw this opportunity, or they saw this job as an opportunity to get rich, to make money. And so they started saying, okay, well, we'll start ruling in favor of whoever gives us the most money. And they started taking bribes. This is a direct violation in the actual law that God established for the nation of Israel. And everyone knew what these two were doing. It wasn't really a big secret. Everyone knew that they were corrupt. Everyone saw what was going on. So you have all of these elders, and basically these would be more of your local tribal leaders, clan leaders, that sort of thing. They come to Samuel, and they said, Samuel, look, you're getting on up there in years, and you can't do this job forever, but your two sons are pretty sorry. Your two sons are cheating people. And so what we want you to do, Samuel, is go and find a person to be the king over the nation and appoint that person as king, just like all the other nations have. And basically what we see, the first truth I want you to see is that the corruption of leaders will always become evident to anyone who will look. And what I mean by that is it's not difficult. It really isn't difficult to start to see corruption within leadership, within political leadership. And a lot of times what will happen is our various political preferences blind us to the corruption of those that think like us, and we excuse that corruption away while the other side sees it. And in the meantime, we're looking at the other side of the political aisle, and we say, well, that person's corrupt, see what they're doing. And the truth is probably both sides have a good point. Both sides realize that the other side has corruption and it needs to be dealt with. And if we are honest, and if we will just step back and take an honest look, oftentimes the corruption's there for anyone to see. And this is what happened in Israel. Everyone could see the corruption of the two sons. Everyone saw what they were doing. Everyone knew it. It wasn't a closely held secret, but no one was doing anything about it. It was being permitted to just go on and happen. And so the people come to Samuel and they say, Samuel, listen, your solution is not going to work. Your solution's not going to work because your kids are corrupt. So here's what we want you to do. We want you to, instead of appointing new judges, we want you to instead come in and appoint a king, just like all the other nations have. And it says in verse 6, and when they said, give us a king to judge us, Samuel considered their demand sinful. So he prayed to the Lord, but the Lord told him, listen to the people and everything they say to you. They have not rejected you, they have rejected me as their king. They are doing the same thing to you that they have done to me since the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, abandoning me and worshiping other gods. So while the problem with Samuel's two sons was genuine, it was a legitimate problem, and the people had a legitimate reason to reject those two, and they had a legitimate reason to come to Samuel. That was only an excuse. That was an excuse for what they were really wanting. See, if you go back and study, you'll find out that God had provided for a king to be installed to lead Israel at a later time. That's very clear when you begin to go through Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, that God always intended to put in a king. That was well known. But when the people came to Samuel and said, appoint a king, they weren't concerned and weren't interested in seeing that plan of God fulfilled, which the plan of God, it's ultimately fulfilled in the person of Jesus Christ. That's not what they were looking for. That's not what they wanted. You see, Israel as a nation had been commanded to stand out from the rest of the nations. They were to follow the one true God. Israel's king was God. He was to be the one who ruled. The judges, people like Samuel and other leaders, they were to be kind of the extension of God's rule, the elders and other such people. What you actually had is the other people, the elders in the nation, what they were saying is, Samuel, we're tired of being different. We want to be just like every other one. And probably many of these elders thought, hey, if we set up a king, there's a pretty good chance that I'm the one who becomes the king. And so there's probably an idea of personal gain as well in this. And so Samuel, he hears this and he recognizes what's really happening. He realizes that, yes, his sons are corrupt. Yes, his sons are a problem. But that's not the issue here. That's not what the people are really wanting. What the people are doing is a sin. It's turning against God. Now, Samuel initially thinks that they're turning against him, and God explains, no, they're not. They're turning against me. They're rejecting me. And what's interesting about this is you go in and you start looking at the rule of Saul, who is the one that the people wanted as king, and God approved it. But Saul's rule was not that good. It was pretty bad. It was pretty corrupt. Because the rejection of God in a society will always result in a corrupt government. I have for a long time taught and preached that the solution that, so many people get this wrong. They think that the solution to the problems of our country or any country is to vote out the corrupt people. And if you get the right leaders in there, then everything will be good. But that's not the case. The reality is, it's the people, when they reject God, the government then reflects that. And this is what Samuel realizes. And this is what God explains to Samuel. They're rejecting me, therefore they're going to get a corrupt government. And so he tells Samuel, he says, listen, here's what you need to do. You need to tell them exactly what this entails. So you pick up in verse number 10, and Samuel told all the Lord's words to the people who were asking him for a king. He said, these are the rights of a king who will rule over you. He will take your sons and put them to use in his chariots, on his horses, or running in front of his chariots. He can appoint them for use as commanders of thousands or commanders of 50s, to plow his ground or to reap his harvest, or to make his weapons of war or the equipment of it for his chariots. He can take your daughters to become perfumers, cooks, and bakers. He can take your best fields, vineyards, and olive orchards and give them to his servants. He can take a tenth of your grain in your vineyards and give them to his officials and servants. He can take your male servants, your female servants, your best young man, and your donkeys and use them for his work. He can take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves can become his servants. When that day comes, you will cry out because of the king that you've chosen for yourself, but the Lord won't answer you on that day. So Samuel begins to lay it out. Here is the penalty. Here's the result of getting a king. This king is going to have all of this authority over you. He's going to be able to draft your kids into the military, into military service. He's going to be able to draft them and use them for his own personal service. He's going to be able to take your property and keep your property, whether it's your fields, whether it's a portion of your harvest, whether it's your servants, whether it's your grain, whatever it is. He'll be able to take all of that and use that however he sees fit. And what's going to happen is you're going to realize one of these days that you got a bad deal, that you've lost personal liberty, that your kids are now his servants. See, humanity is imperfect. This is not a really much of a controversial statement. We can look at and see how imperfect we as human beings are. The source of this imperfection is what's referred to as sin nature. Basically what that means, the sin nature means that people will default to acting in a sinful manner when given the opportunity. As I've oftentimes said, you don't have to teach a child to do what's wrong. They figure that out pretty quick. A child figures out how to lie very easily. They don't have to be taught how to lie. They figure it out by themselves. They have to be taught to do what's right. Now, when a nation is ruled by imperfect people, which every nation in the history of this world has been ruled by imperfect people, it will do wrong things. Every nation does. There is no such thing as a perfect nation. There's no such thing as a perfect government. But when the leaders are actively engaged in pursuing a sinful behavior, then the evil is going to grow exponentially. When they are actively pursuing things other than God's will or God's clearly stated moral basis, the evil is going to get worse and worse and worse. And this is what Samuel was warning of. And again, we can see this throughout history. We can see this in our own nation. You see, a corrupt government will eventually abuse its power and trample the people. And this is what Samuel is warning of. One of these days, you're going to realize that you've appointed sinful people to be over you. And when that day comes, and when you realize that you're dealing with a corrupt government and you turn to the Lord's going to say, this is what you chose. This is what you wanted. I just gave you what you asked for. That is the result. Now, to make a long story short, Samuel basically lays this out, says, this is what's going to happen if you get a king. This is what's going to happen if you get the king that you ask for. And the people say, we don't care. We want our king. And so the next couple chapters is Samuel being led to Saul. Saul is the choice of the people because he looks really good. He looks the part of a king. Turns out to be a bad king, but he looks the part. God approves it. And when you come to Samuel chapter 12, you have the coronation of Saul as the king. And in verses 13 through 15, we read this. Now here is the king that you've chosen, the one you requested. So Samuel is here talking to the nation of Israel. He said, here's the king. Here's Saul. He's the one that you picked. Look, this is the king that the Lord has placed over you. So you wanted Saul, and God gave you Saul. He says, now if you fear the Lord, worship and obey him, and if you don't rebel against the Lord's command, then both you and the king who rules over you will follow the Lord your God. However, if you disobey the Lord and rebel against his command, the Lord's hand will be against you and against your ancestors. So Samuel basically lays it out. He says, listen, you now have the king. You have everything that you asked for. Now, from this point forward, what happens is all on you. If you choose to obey the Lord, if you choose to worship him, if you fear him, if you do what you're supposed to do, then Saul's going to do the same thing. But if you disobey the Lord, if you rebel, if you disobey, if you pursue after other gods, then the result of that is going to be that God is going to be against you. What Samuel is saying is that the government of a nation will always be a reflection of the spiritual condition of the people. And so the simple reality is, when we come to a point where we look at our government and we look at our government officials, whether it's on the federal level, whether it's on the state, county, local level, whatever it may be, and we begin to complain about our government, understand something, that government is simply a reflection of the spiritual condition of the people over that government is over. It is a reflection of us as a people. And the solution to solving the problem of a bad government is not just about voting in good leaders. That is important, and don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that we shouldn't. That absolutely should happen. But if the culture is corrupt, if you're dealing with a corrupt culture, then what the culture produces is going to be corrupt as well. You can't solve the political problems by just putting in new people. If the culture is bad, the people that it produces is going to be bad. You have to address the cultural issue. And the problem with the culture is the spiritual condition of people. If people are lost, if people are living in sin, if people are desiring sin and they are desiring the things of this world and they are not interested in following and worshiping the Lord, then the government of this nation, the government of your state, the government of your county, of your city is going to be corrupt. And it does no good to complain about it, because who's to say that the next government isn't really going to be any better? If you want to solve the problem, you have to get to the root of it, and the root of it is spiritual. In the United States, what is needed today is an attack, a correction, a resolution to the cultural rot that comes from a spiritually lost people. In the last couple series that we've looked at, in the last several messages that and lessons that we've had, all of them come in and bring us to this point. There is a systemic problem within our nation, and it comes from a nation, from a people, from a culture that has rejected the Lord. And the solution has to be on a spiritual level first. And once the spiritual is resolved, then that will impact the culture, that will impact the government. But it must begin on the spiritual level. That's what we need to do. Thank you for joining in on this Bible study. If you have not done so, please like and share this video so that we can share God's Word. We would also like to ask you to subscribe to our channel here and check us out on Facebook. And if you're in the Fort Worth area, know that you're always welcome to join us for any of our services and Bible study.